Um, Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are recording the session just purely so that we can share the presentation with others. So if you do not wish to be have your face on the video, please feel free to turn your camera off. We will also blur all of the screen out when we present the video online. Likewise, if you could please make sure your microphones are off during the presentation, just because it just means it's easier for everyone to hear. This will be a 90-minute session broken down into 3 parts. So the first session will be looking at what a local nature recovery strategy is. And I know we've got a few faces that have been involved with us throughout the whole of the strategy development process. So I apologise for what you will hear for the umpteenth time in that section. But I know we also have some new people with us this evening. So I wanted to make sure that everyone was up to speed on exactly what a strategy is and what we're trying to achieve. But then we'll go into the real heart of what the presentation is, that being what is being proposed as a result of the local nature recovery strategy. And then we'll finish up at the end as to what we understand currently the local nature recovery strategy will be used, how it will be used to inform nature recovery. And I'll also just give you a quick overview of the online mapping tool so that you can really go into the maps that the strategies produce and understand how they're used and how it might affect the land that you're interested in. We do have a Slido for you to put your questions in, but at the moment, as there aren't too many on the call, I'm happy to do hands up. But Alexa, as I no longer can see how many people are on the call, I'll leave it to you to decide whether it's hands up or use the Slido. And we will pause after each section for a Q&A. So please sort of drop your questions as you have them into the Slido, and then Alexa can bring them up after each section. It is an hour and a half, so depending on how the Q&As go and how we're doing for time, I will offer everyone a quick 5-minute break after part 2, but that will be entirely up to you whether you would like to break or not. And finally, just to say that we will be circulating not only a recording of the session, but also a copy of the presentation. So don't worry about having to scribble everything down. So I'll get started now, and first of all begin with a bit of a scene setter as to why it is that we need to recover nature. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 2023 State of Nature report, which gave some very worrying statistics in terms of nature in the country. This shows that UK species abundance had declined by, on average, by around 19%. And in fact showed that 1 in 6 of the assessed species were threatened with extinction. And since those assessments had begun, 151 of the species had already become extinct. Perhaps associated, or certainly one of the causes for this, was that the research also showed that only 1 in 7 of the UK's important habitats for wildlife were found to be in good condition. So perhaps it's not surprising when we find out that we're also losing our species in terms of numbers and diversity. And then what that does lead us to is the very worrying statistic that the UK is currently classified as one of the world's most nature depleted country. But perhaps when you start seeing statistics like this, it's not so surprising. In the year before that, in 2022, the Kent Nature Partnership published their own State of Nature report, and this pretty much reflected what's seen nationally. So this showed that of our assessed species, 10% of those were threatened with extinction. And over 30% of our sites for special scientific interest are not in favourable condition. And when you consider that these are the areas in the county that are home to our rare and endangered species and should collectively represent some of England's best wildlife and geological sites, it's perhaps then not surprising that we find that we have a number of species threatened with extinction. And this lack of management is reflected generally, as the studies showed that there's also been a decline in the area of land under conservation management within the county. And it will probably come as no surprise to anyone that the research also came to the conclusion that majority of our rivers and lakes, and now we also know our coastal waters, are not meeting a good ecological status. And all of these issues and all of these challenges are further compounded by the fact that we have a population in Kent that is growing above average rates. And so that means that concerns over habitat fragmentation and habitat loss and increasing pollution levels that are all sort of result from and associated with the necessary increase in development that's required within the county. This means that these sorts of statistics are unlikely to change without any significant intervention. I'm sure many, if not all of you, would agree that we should be looking to work for nature and recover nature for its own sake. But we also need to recognise that we need to recover nature for our own sake as well, because of the many different services that a healthy natural environment provides for us. It provides provision in services, providing us with food and drink, water supply for many different uses, and also materials for building. It provides us with regulating services. For example, it provides us with clean air, it stores carbon, and also really important to the sector that many of you from this evening, provides pollinating services as well. It also provides supporting services by providing healthy soils and nutrient cycling. And in addition to all of this is the cultural services it provides an opportunity to improve our physical health and mental well-being, opportunities for tourism and likewise recreation. And particularly with recreation and tourism, but also in fact across all of these services, there is an economic association as well, not just from the commodities that we're able to sell as a result of a healthy natural environment, but also by the fact that if we didn't have nature providing these services, we would have to find an engineered solution to many of them ourselves. So this leads us to, in 2022, the government published some legally binding targets to protect our environment, to clean up our air and rivers, and to boost nature. And these legally binding commitments pledge to end the decline of nature and also to then recover nature itself. And recognising that any recovery of nature would need targeted, local, coordinated and collaborative action, the Environment Act set in place a requirement for the development of local nature recovery strategies. And that's what brings us here today. So as I said, the Local Nature Recovery Strategy is a legal requirement of the Environment Act, and there will be 48 of these created across the whole of England with no gaps or overlaps. So if you think of each Local Nature Recovery Strategy as a piece of jigsaw, and collectively they all link together and perfectly give complete coverage across the whole of England. And to make sure that they can join up at the boundaries and they are consistent and compatible with each other, all local nature recovery strategies are led by regulations and statutory guidance and have been developed with the use with a grant from DEFRA. They are a strategic document looking at the natural environment at a landscape scale. And effectively, we are locally developing this strategy for DEFRA, and the local input comes from the appointment of a responsible authority at the local level. And in the case of Kent and Medway, Kent County Council was appointed as that responsible authority. And really important to the local nature recovery strategy was the steer from DEFRA that these should be collaboratively developed. Quite often, strategies, whether they be for nature or anything really, are quite often delivered by a strategic authority, very much behind closed doors with relatively little input from those that will be impacted or affected by the strategy in one guise or another. And the first time you see it is often at this stage at public consultation. But what DEFRA were really keen was for us to make sure that we had not just the usual partners, but all stakeholders involved in the development of the strategy. And the aim and aspiration was that all of these strategies being developed at the local level would ensure that the aims and aspirations for nature recovery could identify what those local priorities and associated actions were, and that collectively they would join together to provide this nature recovery network for England that would contribute to that target of ending decline and supporting nature recovery. So in Kent and Medway, we set about to develop a strategy that would provide us with a set of agreed priorities and alongside sitting with measures to deliver. It would also enable us to bring together a shared vision for nature recovery, and furthermore to look at how the use of nature-based solutions in Kent and Medway could be improved. By working together, we would establish a framework for joined up action. And importantly, because the strategy was developed with those that would be instrumental in its delivery, the strategy would also be would not only be ambitious, but would also be realistic and deliverable. And adding to this further is the fact that the LNRS is linked to a number of supporting mechanisms and financing options, which I'll come to in the third part of the presentation. And finally, this isn't just a strategy of words, it includes maps, and it's very much a strategy that is spatially framed. And those maps focus the action to where it's most needed and where it will deliver the greatest benefits. So I just want to pause for a second just to focus on what the strategy will and won't do, or what it can and can't do, because there has been some discussions as to whether the strategy has any teeth, but also whether it is too influential. So just to really clarify exactly what the strategy will and won't do. So it will identify areas where action is likely to provide the greatest gains, but these are broad areas and are not drawing localised, detailed or definitive boundaries in any way. And where those potential measures are identified and where they are pinpointed to a particular location, there is no dictation of that action or instruction of their implementation. It's purely the identification of a potential measure, a potential action that could be taken in order to support the delivery of nature. And consequently, there is no suggestion that this will force landowners or managers to make changes to the way they use and manage their land or undertake their operations. But there will be some measures whereby which action is incentivised by links to government grants and funding. And again, that's something I'll come to later in the presentation. It also will not offer any statutory protection. Nor will it prevent development from happening. But it will have a role in informing local plans, and it will have a role in informing development management, the determination of planning applications. And again, that'll be something I will pick up at the end. And finally, this will not be the end when we publish it, hopefully in the summer of 2025. In fact, once published, it's when really the real work begins in respect of delivery. And further, the strategy itself will be revised and republished on a regular cycle, and that has to happen under the instruction of the Secretary of State every 3 to 10 years. And our understanding is the ultimate aim, the long-term aim of the local nature recovery strategies collectively is that they will direct action and investment to the areas of greatest need of benefit. And slowly, as the local nature recovery strategy becomes embedded into new local plans, it will also help to direct losses and impacts away from our most valuable assets in terms of nature and the natural environment. In developing the strategy itself, we followed a number of principles to ensure that we were providing and developing a really robust and cohesive strategy. So in the first place, we made sure that anything we were doing was taking into account the character of the landscape, the catchment functions and the ecosystem links to make sure that we maintained the ecological functionality and integrity of the habitats that are present currently in the county and all the services that are already relied on and provided by those. We also wanted to make sure that we focused on addressing the most significant impacts that the county was facing. Now, many of the pressures and challenges facing nature, whether that's in England or just locally, are ones that perhaps are not within the scope of the local nature recovery strategy to directly change or prevent. But what we can do in those cases is look to what the impacts that result from these are and look to minimise or mitigate those impacts and provide a natural environment that is more resilient and more able to adapt to some of those impacts. We also wanted to make sure that where we were undertaking efforts, that these were targeted to our most significant and important habitats. and that's a significance that's determined both locally and nationally. So nationally, this might be because we hold a significant proportion of a certain habitat in Kent, and locally it might be because actually that habitat is very limited within the county, and therefore we wanted to make sure that that resource was well looked after and well provided for, and opportunities for its extension, if possible, were realised. So we weren't just concentrating, though, that are habitats that were threatened in extent. We also looked at habitats that perhaps were facing particular degradation in quality or were at risk from climate change impacts. And while we were considering the needs of the habitats, we also wanted to give detailed consideration to the species that were associated with those habitats, and particularly those that were threatened, and making sure that anything that was designed for the habitat itself also responded to the needs of the species that both relied on the habitat or were really fundamental in that habitat itself. We also wanted to make sure that anything that we were setting out in our priorities supported both local and national priorities and ambitions, things that were already in place and that we could lend weight to. And so these weren't just for priorities for nature, but also we wanted to look at where green and blue infrastructure ambitions were identified at a local level, and also wider environmental, such as ambitions for net zero and flood management, looking to make sure that we could make the most of the opportunities that a healthy natural environment delivers for these. We then, as well as identifying the actions and delivery mechanisms needed to achieve the priorities, there was then the need to target these to areas of the county that were most in need of action, and where those wider benefits can be delivered. And alongside all of this, we wanted to make sure that those opportunities for nature-based solutions were really taken up, really were identified, and therefore we were directing action to where the design of a nature recovery action could also deliver environmental improvements. And that wasn't just about maximising the benefits that a healthy natural environment presents, but also the funding that's available, the resources that are available for nature recovery actions are limited. And if we can help to deliver another service, another solution through also improving nature, this does potentially offer up opportunities to dip into other grants and funding pots. So a very good example is using nature-based solutions to provide mitigation for or minimising or slowing down the risk of surface water flooding. But in doing so, we can also create additional or new habitat and provide some nature benefits. And one of the really key principles for us was we really wanted to embrace the requirement from DEFRA to have this as a participatory process. We wanted to ensure right from the very outset that we had all stakeholders participating, and that wasn't just to tick the box that DEFRA required, but also because we recognised that this would allow us to make sure that the strategy was based on the most up-to-date data and evidence, that it was developed with the input of the many experts that we have within the county, that it was informed by those with local knowledge and practical experience. It's very easy when you're working at a strategic level to not really consider what that local level looks like and whether what you are suggesting really is deliverable at the local level. So it was really important in terms of making it realistic and achievable, was to have that input. And finally, we also wanted to make sure it's a transparent process. As I've said, this will have the ability to inform or potentially direct where investment might go in the county in terms of nature recovery, and also it will influence planning. So we wanted to make sure that it was a process that was completely transparent so that people could have faith in what was being presented. And we were really blown away by the response we got, the response to our sort of call to action to get involved, with over 1,000 people engaged. And in fact, we actually anticipate it probably was probably more likely double that, just because this only really accounts for the formal events that we put in place for the strategy development. But we had a number of other opportunities to engage with stakeholders across the past 12 months. So we envisage that that's likely double. And it wasn't just numbers, because numbers don't necessarily mean that we've had the right input, but we have had participation from across all sectors during the course of the strategy. And I'm really pleased to say that farming and land management were within the top 3 of the sectors represented during the strategy's development. And again, it's not just about numbers, but it's also about representation. So not only was there good broad sector representation, but also we had over 285 different organisations, body, businesses and affiliations involved in the development. So we really do feel that this is a strategy that has been developed with the people of Kent, with the Kent stakeholders and partners for nature recovery. And in addition to this, we also had the input from other partners and stakeholders through our more formal delivery structure, which included a board and delivery group, as a group specific for our local planning authorities to make sure that whatever we were developing was going to work well within the local planning system. We had dedicated advisors from our government agencies and a number of technical advisory groups helping us with some of the detail and technical requirements that the strategy needed. And because we had such an exceptional amount of input, whenever I say in the next part of the presentation, we say this and we want to see that, I really do mean we as in the county. And also it's an important point just to note that although Kent County Council has pulled together this strategy, it is not a Kent County Council strategy. It is a strategy that we have prepared on behalf of DEFRA for the county. So it is not something that KCC has a responsibility for in terms of delivery. It's very much something that we as a county have to pick up. And obviously Kent County Council is one of those delivery partners, but this very much is a county-based strategy, not a KCC one. And just as a final thank you to everyone that has been involved, we really couldn't have done it without you all. And there's been so much time, expertise and support throughout the process. It's been a really enjoyable process to have such a wonderful engagement across the board. So I will pause there and just see if there's any questions on what the purposes of the local nature recovery strategy are and the overarching process of development that we undertook. Alexa, is there any questions or hands up?
Not at the minute. There's nothing in Slido. I'll give everyone a minute in case they anything they'd like to ask.
Okay, right.
All right.
I will. If you do suddenly think of a question, please feel free to pop it into Slido and we can pick it up at the next Q&A break. So I'll move on now to talk about the actual strategy itself. So the strategy is divided into 2 printed documents, or rather written documents, and the online mapping tool. And part one of the strategy effectively sets the context and provides the justification for what's set out in the strategy in terms of priorities and actions. So it looks at what we have within the county in terms of our natural landscape and what makes our county's wildlife and nature just so special. So looking at what we have within the county in terms of habitat and species and what's particularly significant. It also looks at the changes to our land cover, habitat and species, and discusses the pressures, threats and challenges, the sorts of things that's impacting on our natural environment and the sorts of things that we might want the strategy itself to be responding to. And plus it sets that local and national strategic content, looking at the different strategies and ambitions, both nationally and locally, that we're trying to support through the strategy itself. And then finally, it also looks at what opportunities we might have within Kent and Medway and recognises we're not starting from a blank sheet of paper. And there's a huge amount of work already ongoing in the county that we can build on. But my feeling is that many of you will be very familiar with what's presented in that part 1. And so I've decided instead to focus on the real nuts and bolts of the strategy, which is part 2. But should you find when you have a look through part 1, you have any questions regarding this, please do not hesitate to get in contact with the team. So part 2 of the strategy essentially presents the legal requirements, the things that we were legally required to do that must be present in a local nature recovery strategy. And regardless of where that local nature recovery strategy is, these are the elements you will see in every single strategy. So first of all, it will present the principles and visions. It will then set out what the priorities for nature recovery are, what the potential measures have been identified to deliver on those priorities, and then map those potential measures, looking to deliver the best gains, the widest benefits, and also underpin nature-based solutions. There are then 3 strategic maps within the strategy, areas of particular importance for biodiversity, areas that could become of importance, and the local habitat map. And I'll now go through each of those parts in detail, first starting with the principle and vision. So many of you may be familiar with the first 4 principles of our local nature recovery strategy, because we've based these on the Lawton principles. It's well accepted and well known that these 4 principles are considered the approach needed to support a healthy natural environment and to enable nature to recover. So we thought, why reinvent the wheel? And let's use that. So what we're looking within the county is to firstly improve the quality of our existing habitats, better look after essentially what we already have to make sure that they're in a healthy and functioning state. We then move to looking to increase the size of those sites which are most valuable and most important in terms of the habitats they feature or the species they support. And then once we've got our existing habitats in a better and a bigger state, we then look to establish new nature-rich sites. And that's not about providing more space for nature, but also using that those new sites to provide connectivity between our existing core sites. And that brings us to the final principle of Lawton, which is making sure that all of our landscape is joined up. And one of the reasons we need to do that is because a joined up and a landscape that wildlife can more easily navigate through and traverse across allows them to be much more resilient to not only climate change, but also other man-made impacts and pressures that can mean that they might need to move and to migrate across the landscape. And then in addition to those 4 Lawton principles, we also wanted to build in the principle that all of our priorities and all of our potential measures for nature should be looking to make the most of the processes and systems and benefits that a healthy natural environment provides through nature-based solution, and also putting the role of private landowners, land managers and farmers right at the core of what we're trying to achieve, and recognising the really significant and important role they have in delivering a better, more coherent and resilient network for wildlife within the county. When we started reviewing the outcomes that our stakeholders are telling us they wanted to see for nature, there were clear emerging high-level ambitions which centred around broad habitat groupings. So we decided to use these to develop the ambitions that together make up the local nature recovery strategy vision. And under each of these ambitions sit more specific priorities, and many of these priorities drill down to specific habitat types. So these ambitions focus on, firstly, items that we've already discussed, so making sure that our landscape is connected and functional, that we have an increased use of nature-based solutions, and that the importance of land management and land use is recognised. And then alongside that, making sure that species remain at the heart of any habitat management, restoration, extension and creation works. But then moving on to our habitats, we want to see our species-rich grassland restored, connected and extended, that our successional habitats are safeguarded from loss and damage, that woodland trees and hedgerows are brought under more active management, and we see an increase in connectivity and cover across the county, that we see our freshwater habitats being brought to a better state in terms of cleanliness, sufficient water supply and making sure that they're healthy, and also restoring the associated catchment functions so that there's a really connected and supportive freshwater system across the whole of the county. We want to see that nature is better provided for in the urban environment. And that's not just about making space for nature and allowing it to move through the landscape for its own sake, but also so that people within the urban environment still feel connected to nature and still recognise the value it provides. And finally, with one of the longest coastlines in the country, we had to make sure that there was an ambition for our coast, and that is to secure high functioning, natural and connected coastal habitats. Now, there's a lot of words in all of that, as is always the case, but a lot of strategic talk really sometimes struggles to speak to people. So to help people understand what these words really mean, we commissioned some artwork in the summer to illustrate these ambitions, to illustrate the things that people had told us they wanted to see for nature. And arguably, these illustrate it so much better than the text can. And we'll be taking this artwork out and about with us as we move around the county on our consultation roadshow. So please do take the opportunity to come out and have a look at the fabulous artwork or have a look at it online, because likely it will speak to people much better than all the sort of strategic talk that we've included in the ambitions and the vision for the strategy. As I said, sitting under the 10 ambitions are the more detailed priorities which outline the outcomes we want to see for nature in Kent and Medway. And the strategy also identifies priority species that the action should be focused on. The priorities of the strategy were developed with stakeholders through a series of workshops, and they focus on outcomes that tackle the county's most notable pressures and challenges and support delivery of local and national ambitions. And that's delivery of those against our most significant, important and at-risk habitats. There are 52 priorities in the strategy, so I'm sure you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to take you through every single one of those this evening, and I will leave you to read those at your leisure. But these are just some of the examples of the priorities identified under the ambitions of connectivity, nature-based solutions, land management, species-rich grassland and successional habitats. And you can see for the two habitat grouping-based priorities there, ambitions, the priorities relate to specific habitats that sit under those habitat groupings. So, for instance, chalk grasslands there for species-rich habitats. And then we have the ambitions that relate to woodland trees and hedgerows, a priority there, looking at our ancient woodland, focusing on chalk streams within our freshwater ambitions. A look at what can be addressed in terms of the urban environment and the spaces that are provided for nature, and a focus there on coastal chalk cliffs and reefs under our coastal ambitions. And when you get a chance to have a look at the detailed priorities, you'll see that the majority of our very important habitats that we find within the county are represented. We also, as I said, have a number of priority species identified. This was an item of work that was guided by Natural England. We had a process to follow, and it first started by creating a long list of species that were considered under Natural England criteria to represent rare, threatened and significant species. And so we had to identify which of those were present within the county, and this showed that we had over 1,500 rare, threatened and significant species within Kent and Medway, just showing you actually how important our county is to some very important species. But we did have to take this down and reduce it down to a priority listing, and working with all of our species experts from across the county. So we had a technical advisory group of over 30 species specialists within the county to basically, they identified what our priority species were, and they brought it down to 141. And these 141 represent all the taxa that we have within the county. So there is a representation across the county. And these species, these priority species, were not selected just on the basis of need and urgency for their own sake, but also in consideration of whether action for those as an individual species would also support the recovery of other species that were associated with the same habitat assemblage. And what we have is, for each priority species, potential measures to support their recovery are identified, and those measures that action identified to support their recovery has considered the other species that you might find in each of the habitat assemblages that priority species is associated with. And although we have looked to address the 1,362 species not included in that shortlist, but were present in our rare, threatened and important species in the county, we've also included an overarching priority that ensures that consideration is given to all of our threatened and vulnerable species within the county when any nature recovery action work is designed. So sitting under each of those 52 priorities, there are a number of potential measures. And a potential measure is essentially the proposed action that will deliver on that priority. Within the strategy, every priority has its associated measures listed, and these denote which of the strategy principles they relate to. So here's an example of a presentation of a potential measure from the strategy document, and this is an example of coastal and floodplain grazing marsh. So this particular priority has potential measures that relate to delivering on better, delivering more, and delivering better connection for this habitat type. In some instances, supporting measures that may be needed are also presented. This example doesn't have any, but just to bring up an example here from other priorities from across the strategy, these are some of the examples that you might see, or some of the potential measures you might see for supporting measures. Supporting measures actually sit outside the scope of the local nature recovery strategy. The local nature recovery strategy is only supposed to identify actions for either habitats or species, and many of the supporting mechanisms more relate to the sorts of frameworks and the sorts of soft things that we need to do that will enable our actions to actually see result or come to fruition. So for instance, there's some of the potential measures relate to supporting landowners and farmers, providing advice, providing peer-to-peer learning, that sort of thing. So we considered that whilst they sit outside the scope of the local nature recovery strategy, it was really important to include them for information, because these set out what we as a county may need to coordinate on and what we may need to work to provide to ensure the success of the priority itself. And the same applies to additional information needs. So going back to the example for our grazing marsh here, this identifies also data and evidence needs, data and information needs that are required. Again, these sit outside of the scope of the LNRS in terms of delivery, but these are again really important to identify, particularly because most of these were identified when we came to mapping these potential measures. And this is information and data that would enable us to be much more targeted, much more specific, and better understand where these potential measures really are needed within a county. So there's a really useful part in that in helping to inform the next review and revision of the strategy itself. And then finally, within the strategy document and within the tables, you'll also see presented all of the relevant priority species to that particular habitat type. In the measures table and throughout the document, any measures with a reference number, as here, so we have GL 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, any measure with a reference number indicates that it's a measure that has been mapped, and that can be viewed online by selecting the map with that number, and I will show you what that looks like later on in the briefing. We then move to the potential measures mapping. So all of our measures have been mapped and targeted to where they will deliver the best gains, the widest benefits, and also, as I said, nature-based solutions. There's much more detail provided in the strategy document and appendices itself as to how we approach the mapping and in particular the data and evidence that was used to inform it. But in brief, I'll just tell you how we went about it. So first of all, we looked at what data and evidence there was available that we could use to define mapping of each of the potential measures. And this determined whether we had sufficient information to not only map it, but also to make sure that it was targeted to where it was most needed or where the action would be most beneficial. What this resulted in was some of the measures could not be mapped because we didn't have the sufficient data or knowledge to either begin the mapping or certainly to provide the mapping down to a level that would inform our opportunity areas. But also in some cases, the appropriate mapping approach was just too costly or time consuming. But this initial approach of only mapping those areas, or only mapping those measures rather, to areas that could be sufficiently refined, that would help us devise the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, so identifying our opportunities for nature recovery. This meant that some areas of the county appeared from our initial draft mapping to have no potential or importance for nature recovery. This certainly was not the case, and instead it represented areas where measures largely related to improving management, so largely related to that better principle. And therefore there was little on which to prioritise one area over another in the desk-based exercise that it was. Or the available data just simply wasn't sufficient to enable us to go down to what we saw was the required level of refinement to help us identify our nature recovery opportunity areas. But understandably, our stakeholders viewed this as problematic, and they felt that it misrepresented the actual value of these areas to nature recovery. So in response to this, we therefore decided to take the approach that if we could map a potential measure, we would map every potential measure, even if this was only to map it to the extent of basing it on where we knew that habitat type existed or where we knew there was the potential for that habitat type. So in some instances, this did mean that our potential measure maps had effectively covered the whole of the county, but it at least allowed us to recognise that everywhere in the county has some value for various different measures to be delivered. We then took all of our mapping to our stakeholders, to partners, and we reviewed and refined it with them. And this undertook a really important part of work because it helped us to ground truth what was essentially a desk-based mapping work. So it allowed us to test some of the assumptions we made when it came to the refinement and the assumptions that we made in terms of where certain things would be needed, and also allowed people to input their local knowledge to help us focus and target to more defined areas, and also ensured that what our desk-based mapping had suggested would be the right place for certain measures actually was really deliverable when it was considered to that location. That refinement also considered opportunities to address wider environmental challenges. So as I talked about previously in terms of nature-based solutions, so focusing it to areas potentially of high flood risk, but also deliver other benefits such as health and access. So one of the things that we did was where we might have identified the creation of a new habitat area, if that habitat was not particularly sensitive to recreational disturbance, or the likely species that would inhabit it were not particularly sensitive to disturbance from humans, then there was we did look at whether it would be suitable to target that particular habitat creation in areas where there may be low access to green space, or there may be certain instances of health deprivation that increasing the amount of green space could help address some of those issues. So all of those potential maps that we created, all of that mapping is available via the online tool, and I will demonstrate that in the third part of the session. Within the strategy itself, so within the actual strategy document, you'll only see the grouped measures per priority presented. So here we have, going back to our coastal and floodplain grazing marsh example, we have all of the potential measures that have been identified for that particular priority demonstrated on the map. So essentially what you see is all of the opportunity that is presented for coastal and floodplain grazing marsh recovery within the county. But online, you'll be able to actually delve down into the individual potential measures. So in this case, this is one of, again, the grazing marsh potential measures that relates to restoring, extending and creation. And the online presentation allows the scrutiny of these measures, not just on an individual level, but also you can go down to a more localized level using the zoom in function. And again, I will demonstrate that when I come to the mapping explanation. So that then brings us to the three strategic maps that we were required to develop for the strategy. The first of these being areas of particular importance for biodiversity. So these were basically mapped on the basis of what we were required to include on them. So we had to adhere to the regulations. We had no autonomy as to how these were mapped. And these include all of our nationally designated sites, our local wildlife sites and local nature reserves, and all of the irreplaceable habitats as defined by Biodiversity Net Gain. So in Kent, we have ancient woodland, ancient trees, coastal sand dunes, Spartina swards and lowland fens, and those were the only irreplaceable habitats mapped within the county. And the basis for this map is the belief of DEFRA that this map represents all the areas in the county that are already offered some level of protection or some level of conservation management through either the designations they hold, the legal frameworks, and also planning policy that might be presented within the local plans. The second strategic map was presenting areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, and these effectively are our mapped opportunity and target areas for nature recovery. The way we went about mapping our areas that could become of importance for biodiversity was essentially going back to our potential measures and using this as a foundation. Now, as you know, we ended up mapping all of our potential measures, and this did mean that we did have some that weren't sufficiently refined. So these insufficiently refined maps were excluded, and largely this excluded any measures which did not focus on restoration, creation or connection. And we are fairly confident that this will not result in sort of any unfairness in terms of excluding measures that perhaps relate to management, because our understanding is in terms of funding that's likely to be released, it's likely to focus mainly on restoration, creation and connection. So we envisage that this shouldn't disadvantage any, or certainly not many, areas of the county where those maps were excluded. We then did further refinement of these, really considering our wider environmental challenges and really drilling down to those wider benefits to make sure that we really had focused into those areas that were most in need of the nature-based solutions and other benefits that could be offered. And then our final level or area of refinement of the mapping was to apply connectivity modelling. So this was used to refine the mapping and place priority on areas of low species flow, but areas where there were bottlenecks to connectivity, and also buffering and linking our existing areas of particular importance. And the rationale for this was being that joined up, if you think of our better, bigger, more joined up principles as a hierarchy, that you start with better, but your ultimate goal is to end up with to have everything better joined up, then by focusing our actions in areas where we know there are connectivity issues, then we would result in a landscape that was better connected. And this is a map that demonstrates really why we couldn't use all of our potential measures mapping to inform the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity. This map illustrates the point really well by featuring all the mapped potential measures. And as you can see, pretty much the whole of the county is covered in one regard or another. And this isn't surprising. It basically does show us what we already know, that everywhere in the county has the potential to be an important area for nature. And I think that's really important to remember when you come to looking at the mapping. Just because there may not be a measure or a particular measure might not be mapped to a particular piece of land that you're looking at, that does not mean that there isn't value in doing something at that local level. It's just that we were required to be more focused in identifying these areas for the local nature recovery strategy. And where that brings us to is areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity map that looks like so, which has about a 38% coverage of the county. The final map that we were required to produce was the local habitat map. And essentially this is our areas of particular importance for biodiversity combined with our areas that could become of importance for biodiversity to create a local habitat map that identifies areas of strategic significance within the county. And I'll explain in more detail what those areas of strategic significance actually mean in practice in the final part of the presentation. And so our local habitat map effectively looks like so. And I will then pause again now just to see if there are any questions about the strategy ambitions themselves, the priority measures and mapping before I go on to talk about what this actually all might mean in practice and how you can use the maps to identify that action. So Alexa, any hands up or questions in Slido?
No, not at the minute.
So this final session is addressing, as we understand it, how the local nature recovery strategy will be used to inform nature recovery and the different mechanisms and delivery frameworks that are in place to support it. There is a lot of guidance that's still outstanding. So a lot of this is based on the limited information that we've had to date, what we've pieced together from it. And if it's an out and out assumption, I will let you know. So do not fear that I'm going to be leading you up the garden path with the wrong idea. Also in this session, we're going to have a look at how the mapping tool can be used. Just to say that the tool that's currently online has been just created for the purposes of the consultation. So I always go to say at this point, it's a simple tool, and Kent Wildlife Trust would probably drop down in shock at the idea of me suggesting this is simple. They have done incredible work in producing the maps and then presenting them online. And when I say it's a simple tool, what I mean is there's limited functionality. And the reason we haven't developed our final online mapping tool just yet is, as I say, we're still waiting on information and guidance as to how the local nature recovery strategy will feed into planning, how it will feed into funding and grants and other mechanisms. And what we want to make sure is when we do publish an online tool, that it has all the information that you will need to help you support how the local nature recovery strategy is going to work in practice. So we didn't want to spend time and money on a tool that in 6 months' time we found was redundant. So we're not actually, the tool itself is not part of the consultation. We're not inviting feedback on this. It's purely there just to enable you to have a look at the measures mapping and the local habitat map layers. But what we will be doing, and particularly in terms of this sector, we will be going out to the likely users of the online tool between now and the summer to understand how you envisage you might want to use the tool, and therefore what features within that online tool, if we can, we will include. So looking at the tool as it stands currently, when you first launch the mapping tool, you will get the pop-up that's shown. And we just invite you to read through a little introduction and click the OK button to take you through. Just to note as well, the important thing on that introductory note when you launch the tool is the sort of asked to be a bit patient. As I said, there's a lot of information that sits behind all of these mapping layers, and some of them can take a little while to launch. It shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. So if you find it's going over 2 minutes, it might be worth refreshing. For me, it's usually just a couple of seconds, but it really does depend on both the internet speed you have and also your computer specification. So please do take time. We haven't had to date any issues with people using the tool, but if you are finding it's taken a really long time to load, please do get in contact. So once you've clicked OK, you'll be presented with the map looking like this. And you click on the layers menu in the right hand side, and that gives you this drop down function. And there's a number of different mapping functions that you can select from this. So first of all, you can select your preferred baseline map. So the options at the moment are street map, which is what we currently have it on here, grayscale, or you can also look at it with satellite imagery. Street map is the default view, but you can just select whichever one you want if that's not the one you prefer. You can also have the opportunity to decide whether the map presents the district boundaries, the district labels, and also the main rivers network. The default for this is all of those to be switched on. So if you don't want any, or you just want some of those, you can just select that again just by clicking the option. On the left-hand side of the screen, there's a number of different functions there that can help you interrogate the information a bit more. So you have a tables icon, and by clicking on that, you'll get full details of all the mapped potential measures. When you click on to determine the potential measures by selecting the different habitats or priority groupings there, what you will find is just the number reference. That's because the majority of our potential measures are very wordy. And if we were to include the full potential measure outline, we would have pages and pages of links for you to select on. So we have just got the reference number in the mapping layers side of things, but you can find all the information you need by clicking on that little icon at the side. And also finally, the other function you have is this plus and minus, which allows you to zoom in and out of the map and go down to more detail or get a broader view. So as I said, if you want to know what a potential measure reference number relates to, you simply click that little tables icon, and then within the table that pops up, you just insert the potential measure reference number, and it will come up not only with what the potential measure is, but also will tell you whether that was used to inform the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, and also provides a brief description of the mapping methodology. And more detail on the mapping method and the data sources are within the main strategy document. But what this does mean is you don't have to flick between the online tool and the strategy document itself. You can get the information that you will need when looking at the measures to hand. So one of the first purposes of the strategy is to direct action for nature recovery. So the strategy, as I've said, proposes action required and then maps where these could be delivered. And in some instances, these are wide-ranging areas covering broad areas of the county, and in others, they are specific areas, and that's purely dependent, as I said previously, on the mapping capability, how far we were able to really refine that mapping down. In all cases, the mapped areas are indicative, so they purely are saying this is where this action could happen and where it's considered to have the best impacts, the best benefits, the best outcomes for that particular priority to the best of our ability to define that down. Some of the management measures that are included in the strategy are aiming to increase the functionality or biodiversity of a habitat. And these particular management measures, some of them have been mapped, some of them have not. This mapping indicates where this management may be needed or results in the greatest gain. But it's really important that just because it's been mapped to a defined layer or defined area does not mean that introduction of that management will not deliver benefits. The introduction of any appropriate management, so that's management being the right management in the right place at the right time for the right reasons. If you're introducing that appropriate management anywhere, it will deliver benefits. So just because you might have a piece of land where you think that management would offer opportunities, if it's not mapped, that's not to say that's not the case. The strategic nature of the document also means that other measures that may not be relevant or appropriate when considered at in detail at the local level. So it might be that we have identified certain measures that have gone down to that local level and have defined that at a strategic level, they're not considered valuable. However, that does not mean, again, that measure at a local level, when considered at the very local level, isn't important. So exclusion from the mapping does not indicate that the action is applicable. It's just that at a strategic level, it does not present the same value as other areas in the county for delivery of that action. And further, because the desk-based approach that we took, because it's basically based on assumptions and it's theoretical, It is not based on actual site conditions, and we have not gone down and ground truth every area that has been mapped, because that just isn't possible at a county scale. So that means that before any action is implemented, you would need to undertake site assessments, and also to say that if an action has been mapped to a particular area, that does not preclude the need for the usual permissions and prerequisites that would be required. And all of that is required to inform the appropriateness of the action at that local level. The strategy and the associated maps also do not dictate the actions, nor do they instruct their implementation. They are simply a guide for how landowners and managers could use or manage the land or approach their operations in a way that could support the recovery of nature. But in no ways do these maps indicate that this must happen at this location. We've received some advice from DEFRA as to what the local nature recovery strategy might indicate in terms of directing action for farmers and land managers. And this has suggested that it could provide information to farmers and land managers in helping them choose which of the stewardship or SFI options might be appropriate for their land. It can also help groups of farmers. Could be of use to many of the clusters that we see growing across Kent, to help shape nature recovery priorities for a broader area. And also it's hoped that this might encourage collaboration across holdings and landscapes. They're also suggesting that it will identify opportunities for landscape recovery project proposals and could provide necessary evidence to support the application, and certainly should be used to develop the project. And finally, government have also suggested that they might use the local nature recovery as a criterion application, so it will help the government to consider applications for funding for specific nature recovery activities. DEFRA have also noted some other potential future uses, but they state that very clearly that these are going to require further exploration before being introduced. But again, ones which might be of interest to you is they could be used to identify where funding could be made available to encourage farmers and land management to carry out the most environmentally impactful actions on their land. They could be used as a required criteria for any future government nature recovery funding schemes, meaning that actions proposed in the strategy would be eligible for funding. They've suggested that it could be used to inform where private companies choose to provide corporate donations for habitat creation or other enhancement projects that deliver on the proposals within a local nature recovery strategy. And also that potentially it might be used to guide private finance investments in nature and carbon markets. But again, these are all things that DEFRA is currently being looked at, and there's for both these and the previous ones which DEFRA have told us are a likely use. We don't have any further information in terms of what mechanisms will be used to underpin that than what I've just outlined there. So in terms of the online mapping, it's likely that you might want to use it to identify whether a delivery of a certain measure has been mapped for a specific area that you're interested in. Now, you may already know the particular measure or priority reference you're interested in, because you may have picked that up by looking through the strategy itself. But if you're just looking for any priority or measure that relates to a specific habitat type you're interested in, you can use the table to identify these. So first of all, you would click on that table icon, and when you bring the table icon up, in the measures search box, so the next box along, you would add in the particular habitat type you're interested in. So in this case, I've inputted grazing marsh, and that brings up 3 potential measures that have been mapped that make reference to nature recovery actions within grazing marsh. So then you would consider those, you would look to whether they are of all of interest to you or just one, and you would just note down which of the ones are of particular interest. And then you would take those reference numbers and select the grassland habitats drop-down box and click on the particular measure that you're interested in. You can select more than one measure at a time within the online tool, but at the moment, because of the simplified functionality. It will not distinguish between the potential measures. It will just show you where all of those potential measures have been identified within the landscape. But what this does show when you do select just one is where opportunities for delivery of this potential measure have been identified to exist, and that's identified through the blue shading on the map. And as I said, there is a zoom function, so you can zoom in and out by clicking the plus and minus buttons on the left hand side, and you are able to zoom in more detailed than that as well. So that's how it might be used to direct nature recovery action. But one of the other areas that has been identified for that the strategy does influence is this areas of strategic significance. So areas of strategic significance is something, if you recall, that is defined by the local habitat map. So anything that sits within the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, or anything that sits within the areas of particular importance for biodiversity, would be considered as strategically significant. So one of the areas that we understand that this will come into play is informing grant and funding and investment. And although we haven't been told the mechanisms by which it would happen, the way we envisage it would be is that if a potential measure falls within areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, then not only if your land falls within an area of strategic significance, but also the action you're proposing aligns with the potential measures that have been identified for that particular area, then there is a chance that this will be classed as strategically significant, and therefore would make it eligible for grant funding and investments, and any schemes that will use in the LNRS as an indicator for eligibility. So that's really an assumption. That's how we envisage it would be used. But the one area where we do have a bit better understanding of where strategic significance will come into play in the future is in the use of biodiversity net gain. Biodiversity net gain is a mandatory requirement that aims to make sure that development has a measurably positive impact on biodiversity, and that gain is calculated through the use of a standard metric, and that calculation tool effectively identifies what the biodiversity value is of the land that's lost and what the value is of the biodiversity that's been gained by the proposed response to deliver on that 10%. Within that metric, there is a strategic significance multiplier, and that is related to the local habitat map and the potential measures that fall within it. So biodiversity net gain just on its own obviously does have the potential to make a difference to nature recovery, because it is going to be theoretically putting more back than what that development is taking out. But that gain will be much more meaningful in terms of nature recovery if the gains are not only situated in the areas of greatest needs, but are also delivering on the action that is required. So therefore, the high strategic significance will be applied when the habitat parcel is located in an area proposed to help deliver the local nature recovery strategy priorities, so i.e. the local habitat map, and also that the intervention that is being suggested is consistent with the potential measure that has been proposed for that location. The areas of strategic significance also have other roles in terms of planning, but it's really important to understand that these areas of strategic significance, and particularly the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, do not indicate an area where development should be excluded, and they also do not dictate or place any limitations on actions or how the land should be used. And in the absence of this guidance, so we are told that guidance on how the LNRS will work and inform local planning is imminent. But in the absence of that, we don't expect that there will be any requirements for revisions to local plans and policies in relation to the published strategy. However, we do know that once the strategy is published, there will be a requirement to some extent for local plan entities to have regard to it, but how this actually works out in practice, we don't know yet. But the one thing we do know is that there is a statutory requirement on local planning authorities to have account of the areas of strategic significance and the local habitat maps itself and the actions and priorities that the strategy presents. So we do know that the local nature recovery strategy will be an important and statutory source of spatial information that will inform land use planning and will ensure that nature and opportunities for its recovery are considered within local planning. So the way in which you would use the local habitat, the mapping online, and use a local habitat map to consider where priorities might be delivered is, first of all, to actually just view the areas of strategic significance itself. You click on the two areas that make up the local habitat map. So that is the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity and the areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And essentially anything that is coloured either yellow or green is within the local habitat map, and therefore anything yellow or green denotes an area of strategic significance. If you want to consider or determine whether a particular potential measure you're interested in is situated within an area of strategic significance, you firstly will go to the various potential measures layers and select the potential measure you're particularly interested in. So sticking with the grazing marsh restoration, creation and extension. So you select that, and then you select the two layers that make up the areas of strategic significance. So you select areas that could become of importance for biodiversity and areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And it will create this beautiful multicoloured map that you see on the screen now. So what this actually means is where you have patches of dark green and where you have patches of orange, as indicated by the arrows here, these mean that the potential measure falls within an area of strategic significance. So in this case, you've got the dark green is representing where the potential measure falls within an area of particular importance, and the orange is where that potential measure is falling in an area that could become of particular importance for biodiversity. But essentially, you don't need to worry too much about which is which. It's just essentially, if it's dark green or orange, that potential measure falls in an area of strategic significance. Areas where there is blue on the map is where that potential measure has been mapped to that location, and there still is a value to delivering on that potential measure in that location. It still will deliver nature recovery, but when the value of that nature recovery is considered at a strategic level, it's not considered strategically significant. So locally, that might provide some really valuable and really necessary habitat, but in terms of the context of the defined areas that could become of importance, so pretty much focusing on those areas of connectivity, the blue areas are areas that were considered not to be strategically significant when considered against other areas. And also on that map, you'll see some lighter green colours and some yellow. Where those are, they're basically where the areas of strategic significance fall, but there is just no potential measure, or that potential measure is not currently mapped within those areas. You can, of course, view it separately. So you can consider where that potential measure falls within an area of particular importance for biodiversity, and or just where it falls within an area that could become of importance for biodiversity. We don't yet know whether that will be required, but potentially it could be that some funding streams will only fund measures that don't sit within an already designated area. So that would be your areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, or conversely, it could be some particular funding streams or grant streams are looking at delivering nature recovery in areas that are already designated. So that would just allow you to define between the two. So that's the various ways in which the mapping works, but there are other opportunities for the local nature recovery strategy to influence and to deliver. And one of the ways, as I said, is by influencing local planning. So once it is published, hopefully in the summer of 2025, there will be a requirement on all planning authorities to take account of the strategy when they prepare new local plans, new minerals and waste plans, and new neighbourhood plans. So This is a really important role and make sure that nature and opportunities for its recovery are considered against other future demands and needs of the county's land. But as I said previously, because we don't currently have that guidance, it's not expected that there will be any retrospective application of the local nature recovery strategy against those plans that are already in place. And that also includes plans that are currently undergoing revision and are a long way down their local plan revision process. It's also not expected that they will be applied to any land use decisions already taken, and that includes allocated sites. And again, it's important to remember that the strategy is not designed as a tool to prevent development, and nor do the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity preclude development. Instead, the intention is these areas and the strategy through in time will help to inform future local plans, and through its role in biodiversity net gain, both of these two things together can help guide development in maximising positive outcomes for nature. When you do come to look at the maps, you might see that there is more than one potential measure identified for a location. And the reason we have done that is because we feel this ensures that no opportunity for nature recovery is missed, because we don't know when the local site is properly considered. We don't know which is the most appropriate measure, and also an individual landowner may have a preference over one than the other. They might not want to develop one particular habitat type, but they might be happy to manage another. So we didn't want to exclude any potential measures without really knowing the local area or the local level and the needs and interests on that. And also what this does mean is, because we haven't excluded one potential measure over another, it does mean that when landowners are collectively looking at broad areas, that any interventions will consider a wide range of habitats, and that will help to consider that mosaic of habitats that we know that nature recovery needs. Further work will be undertaken to provide a better steer on our priorities for the published strategy, and we envisage that these will be based on essentially using the strategy principles as a hierarchy. So where there are more than one measure in place, you would first start by making sure that things were in a better state, that appropriate management was in place, because there's very little point in extending or creating new if it's not going to be looked after once it's in place. But once that appropriate management is in place, you would then go to either building on what is already there by extending and buffering, or if there is not the opportunity to extend, to then establish new in the area. And we envisage that by delivering the first of these three principles and focusing that action in the areas that could become of particular importance for biodiversity, because we have targeted our areas that could become of importance for biodiversity in areas where we know connectivity is really important and is needed, that by focusing that these three principles and these three actions in these areas, that we will effectively deliver the joined up, the connectivity that we need. Also, we will look at how we can maybe give prioritisation to measures which offer the opportunity to support against the strategy's identified priority species, and making sure that, going back to that requirement, that we need to not only think about habitats but think about species themselves. So just the final slide here, just to say, so we've, throughout the process, and particularly just in sort of presenting these briefings, we've had a lot of questions about how far does this strategy go in terms of protecting nature. So it's sort of a reminder at the end of this, just to say that this is not a strategy that aims to protect nature. It's a strategy that provides a framework for action that delivers nature recovery and steers that action to where it's most needed and where it will deliver the greatest gains. No element of the strategy or its mapping offers any formal or otherwise protection, and that can only be provided through statutory designations, through legal protections, and also local planning policy. Now, of course, in time, the local nature recovery strategy and its areas that could become of importance for biodiversity will be used to inform new local plans, and local authorities may choose to use the strategy to identify land that could be set aside for the purposes of nature recovery, but there is no requirement on them to do that. There is also a potential role for the local nature recovery strategy to help inform the identification of areas that could potentially contribute to the government's 30 by 30 commitment, that being to effectively conserve and manage 30% of England's lands and seas by 2030. So there is a potential that we might see some of these areas going forward to inform that, but again, that is not a given. So in all cases, no element of the mapping should be viewed as some sort of level of protection or prevention. It's about directing action to where it's most needed. So that concludes the overview. But before I finish, I'd like to use this quote from the wonderful Sir David Attenborough to remind us of why such a strategy and the ownership and delivery of it together is so important. And also, just to say, it's really important that we hear your views on the strategy so that we can ensure that it is something that you not only endorse and support, but also that you would be happy to adopt in the delivery of your action for nature recovery. And just a note to say that the strategy itself is very long and has various parts. So consequently, the consultation questionnaire, when you first look at it, does appear to be a lot of questions that will take a lot of time. However, please don't be put off by this. You do not need to answer all the questions. You can pick and choose which questions you wish to answer. And so you can take as much time or as little time as you want and tell us what parts, feedback on the parts that you feel you really want to talk to us about. But that's the presentation finished there. So I'll now hand over to Alexa to direct me to any questions that may have come up.
Thanks, Liz. We've just got one at the minute, which is from Tom, going back to the mapping, saying, would the blue areas be considered mid-tier strategic significance for BNG? I think he's referring to
yes,
where you've got the blue bits.
So where you've got the blue. So potentially that could be where we might define it. So it will be down, as I understand it, it will be down to collectively the local planning authorities to determine how they define the strategic significance in that regard. The problem is we've had very little practical experience and seeing it from other local nature recovery strategies because there aren't that many that have been published. But as we understand it, it's only clearly defines where strategic significance is, and that is in those areas where the potential measure aligns to the area. So I suppose potentially it could be that it's the right potential measure, but it's not in the right area, might define it as medium, or it could be that you're delivering something in an area of strategic significance, but it's not the measure. So I suppose it could be one of two ways, but we will need to get more clear advice from DEFRA as to how that all works in practice. The other big issue question in terms of those mappings of areas of strategic significance is the advice from DEFRA that that those boundaries are not definitive. They're not localized, but of course, as soon as you put a line on a map, you very much come up with a potential definitive boundary, and particularly when those maps are being used for planning. So we need to understand from DEFRA where the fuzziness of those boundaries lie, because obviously, if you were developing you were developing in an area of strategic significance, that will mean that you will have to put more back. If you are delivering your gain in an area of strategic significance and you align with the potential measure, then what you are delivering in that case will have greater value. So you'll effectively get more bang for your buck. So you could see where potentially a developer or a biodiversity net gain provider, if the land that they're interested in, whether that's the land for development or the land for BNG, if that land falls just outside that boundary, bearing in mind that this has all been a desk-based exercise, the question is what right of reply do they have in terms of planning to justify that actually they consider that is in an area of strategic significance or it isn't? And that's something, again, that we're seeking advice from. So unfortunately, the problem is we've been asked to create a strategy on behalf of DEFRA when we don't hold any of the the answers to the obvious questions that come out in terms of its implementation. So sorry, that's not a very helpful reply, but we will be taking all of these questions about how this actually works in practice back to DEFRA through Natural England, and as we get responses, we will be posting it up on our frequently asked questions page on the website. So please do sort of look back at that, and hopefully we'll be able to get a better answer for you.
We've got a couple of other questions, Liz, from Guy and Charles, but I'm just going to skip to another one from Tom, which is about mapping before we, just to keep it in sort of topic areas. He was asking whether if identify an area on the map where we think, which we think should be considered as part of the ASIB, is there a way of letting us know about this?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, what we will need is we'll need some level of justification for why it should be included. So you need to go back to what the potential measure is that you think should be delivered there, and how that meets the criteria or requirements of the mapping. So bearing in mind that the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity, those have been refined in terms of connectivity. So it really is just a case of sending us what area you think, what your justification is for why it should be included in the ASIB. And I think the first thing to do as well is to just check that it's not included in the potential measure, because obviously the potential measures to one extent or another have mapped the opportunity. So it might be that the opportunity has been mapped, but for some reason that particular area of land has not been considered to fit within the refinement process of the ASIB. So first of all, check with the relevant potential measures and see if it's been mapped there, because if it hasn't been mapped there, then there's likely a mapping error. If it has been mapped there, it could be that it hasn't been considered to meet the criteria for the areas that could become of importance for biodiversity. So then we would just ask for you to just give us a bit of justification for why you think it does. Ideally, if you have the ability to provide us that as a GIS layer, as a map layer, as opposed to a line on a piece of paper, that would be perfect, because as you can imagine, we do have the potential to receive hundreds of bits of paper. But if that's not possible, then just send us through with as detailed a boundary as you can provide on it. And then what we will do is we will obviously take into all of these proposals into consideration, and it might be that we'll come back to you. So anything you do submit, please do make sure your contact details are provided as well, so that if needs be, we can come back to you with further questions.
Great. And we will be circulating details for how to take part in the consultation after this. So if you haven't seen it yet, don't worry, you'll get an email with all the information shortly.
Absolutely.
Okay. So other question, Guy's been very kind about all the work that's gone into this, but he's also asking if we've got any inkling of how this is going to feed into the land use framework.
No, not at the moment is the quick answer. I mean, I think this is something that we need to take back to DEFRA, because even if I had the chance to read the land use framework, which I haven't yet, in all honesty, I suppose what I probably should have done, Guy, if I'm honest, had done a very quick word search in the document to see if it is mentioned and how it's mentioned. But even if it is and where it is, I would be making assumptions as to what that actually means. So I will take that question back to Natural England. There are a lot of things that the LNRS you would think would have an informing role in. Not least of all, also the planning reform proposals in terms of these nature recovery delivery plans. Their local nature recovery strategies are only mentioned once in relation to the production of those. And my understanding is in terms of the land use framework, a lot of the work could possibly duplicate what we've done with the LNRS as well. So we do need to make sure we understand how this all slots together. So rather than giving my idea of how it might work, I'll actually find out for you specifically how it might work.
Okey-dokey. And Charles was wondering how many votes we've had yet for flagship species, whether that might give a good idea of how widely the consultation's being viewed.
Well, I can't remember off the top of my head the flagship species, but I know we've had more more submissions to the flagship species voting than we have to the consultation. After the first, I think it was week and a half, 2 weeks, I think we had about 50 odd submissions to the consultation. So 50 odd submissions of the consultation questionnaire, which matches relatively well to what we'd envisage for a strategy of this kind, because what we have to remember is this strategy is proposing potential actions, and it's usually that the things that really grab people's attention is where you are actually going to make a change rather than you're just proposing what could happen. We're doing a lot of work over the next few, so we've focused on getting the message out through these briefings to help people have a better understanding of what the strategy is, and then they can go away and read it. And our last one is tomorrow night. And then after that, I've sort of alluded to this consultation roadshow. So we will be coming to a library or a venue near you over the next 2 months. And we hope to capture other people that way. We're attending farmers markets, we're going to libraries, we're going to country parks to try and get as many different people aware of the consultation. I think there is a fact that just so the general public might find the strategy itself a bit bewildering. So what we are also doing is at these sort of public consultation events is we're taking along a very simplified summary that just says this is what we're aiming to achieve. So basically the vision and ambition and what habitats we're focusing on. And we're asking people if they think that's right, so that if they don't feel that they're sufficiently informed to know whether the potential measures are correct or where we're suggesting they happen. So we're giving them an easier way to feed in when they come and talk to us in person. But we will be going, like I say, around the different locations and taking our artwork with us as well. So hopefully that's another way that we can engage people to understand what we mean by all this jargon. Any other questions, Alexa?
No, not at the minute, but Charles kindly saying 50 replies so far is good.
Yes,
and
no, I
think,
agree.
Yeah, considering it's only been a couple of weeks, it really is, early days.
And all of those 50 have been from individuals, because of course, probably a lot of organisations and networks and associations and the like will probably wait to discuss amongst colleagues and peers before they submit their responses. So those are actually from individuals, and no doubt we will get responses. But there is also the fact that we don't know yet, Charles, sort of whether people don't feel they need to respond to the consultation because of the extent of that they were involved in the process of development itself. So if when they look at the strategy, they think, yep, that reflects what I said and what I wanted to see, there's a chance that we won't get anything back, because you don't often get people going through a consultation questionnaire to tell you you've got it right. It's more often to tell you you got it wrong. So anything else there, Alexa?
No, not a minute.
Okay.
Well, hang on a minute, guys.
Got one more. I was
going
going to get away to my dinner.
It seems ridiculous. There's only 5 of us in here or something. It seems ridiculous typing it out again. Can you just remind me what the deadline is for finishing
the 12th of March. 12th of March is the end for the consultation period, and then we hope to have it published by the summer. We're not putting a firm date on the publication, just simply because there are a few sort of hoops we have to jump through before we can publish it. So as we had to with the consultation, so before we went out to consultation, we had to give all of our planning authorities in Natural England 28 days to review the draft to say they were happy for us to proceed to public consultation. We need to do that again another 28 days so that they can tell us if they object. So it's not so much they approve us to go out, it's more that they have the opportunity to object to us publishing. There were some, not issues is too strong a word, but there were some queries over some elements of the strategy with the local planning authorities. They were happy for it to go out to public consultation without those being resolved, but they will need to be resolved in order for them to say they're happy for it to be published. So there is still some work that needs to be done that particularly relates to the mapping. And again, how quickly we can get to the point of having the strategy finalised really depends on the level of response we get from the consultation. And also, really importantly, I think the most likely area is how much more work we have to do to the maps, which is obviously quite time consuming. So that's why we were being a bit vague and saying summer, but between you, me and everyone else who then watches this recording, we're aiming for late June. But certainly published, I would hope, by the end of summer.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Liz.
Any other hands up, Alexa?
Yep.
Lovely.
Everybody's gone home. It's past
it's
supper time.
Definitely tea time, isn't it? Yeah, I know my stomach's saying it. So, well, thank you everyone who has stayed on. Thank you very much for joining us. I will send round a upload on YouTube of the recording of this presentation. So you please feel free and please do share with any colleagues or partners that you think might be interested. And on that will also be the presentation slides and all the information that you need about the consultation. But for now, I'll say good night and thank you to everyone, and no doubt speak to you all soon. Thank you.